It might sound like there's not enough oversight of MPs, but in his column this week, Douglas Murray says unelected officials have the real power. To explain, Douglas joins me now alongside James Forsyth. Douglas, thanks again for joining us on Spectator TV. You write in your column that the most boring conversation in the nation is back. What is it exactly?
Yes, Lord's reform. Who doesn't quiver slightly when they just hear those words? Lord's reform is one of the most boring conversations in Britain because it's essentially unsolvable, and it's happened and gone on throughout all of our lifetimes. Many of us remember the debates in the 1990s over this, particularly with getting the hereditaries down. Ever since then, there's been intermittent claims and calls for more reform. And the reason it's so tedious is because there really aren't any good options. Intermittently, people claim, well, just scrap the entire chamber. That's a terrible option because you do need a second chamber to revise legislation. Every way you look at how it should be made up, you enter all sorts of trouble. And then you get the one which we're in at the moment, which is the perennial cash for peerages debate. And, this is serious because we all worry about the way in which money influences politics. It's I think that in many ways Britain is lucky that we have less buying of influence than many other democracies, actually. But the peerages issue is always going to be a strong one because effectively if you don't have state-funded political parties, and political parties need to raise money through private donors and trade unions in the case of Labour, people are going to have to be given some incentive to give millions of pounds to a political party simply through the good of your heart or through something else. It is a strange thing to do. Not very many people would do it. So there need to be inducements. There are going to be inducements. And one of them, and it's an open secret, is that if you give enough money to a political party, you may find yourself able to be suggested as being a potential peer. It's not a great system at all. I don't like it any more than anyone else. But as I say, what are the other options?
James, it hasn't been a good week for the government, has it? Can you give us the latest update with Owen Paterson, Geoffrey Cox, and the cash for peerages story?
Yeah, the government has basically created a scandal that has run all week and I think is beginning to do real damage to the Tory party. Its actions in trying to stay the guilty verdict against Owen Paterson and then kind of trying to reform the rules on the back of that was so brazen it has created a backlash. It has got everyone looking at MPs' second jobs, and it has put Boris Johnson in a very difficult position. He's having to choose whether to be on the right side of public opinion or the right side of his own MPs, because I think if you're judging from what MPs say they're getting in their inboxes, there's no doubt that most of the public question why MPs need to have the ability to earn money other than their £82,000 a year parliamentary salary. Yet, at the same time, Tory MPs, and particularly more traditional Tory MPs, think, they have these outside interests which they are reluctant to give up. And they also think, and I think this is not an invalid point, that if you basically bar MPs from doing any other work other than their parliamentary work, you are going to limit Parliament to those who wish to be professional politicians, and you are going to end, the ranks of kind of QC MPs that you had. People like Ken Clarke or Michael Howard, and I think that would narrow the experience available to Parliament, and I think it would denude Parliament of quality. I think one of the problems we've already got at the moment is that there is a tendency for, and Theresa May is an honourable exception to this, there's a tendency for former Prime Ministers to kind of quit the Commons as soon as they've left office. I think if you banned all outside interests, I think you would find that nearly all former Cabinet Ministers quit the Commons as soon as they had left office.
Douglas, you wonder in your column this week whether trying to reform the Lords and the Commons misses a crucial point. Do our representatives even have that much power in Parliament anymore?
Yes, this is something which I've been reflecting on for a long time, as I mentioned, not just in relation to the House of Lords, but the House of Commons as well. Remember one of the main slogan of the Brexiteers was "Take Back Control," And I say in my column this week, when the British public voted to take back control from unelected bureaucrats in Brussels, I do not think that we intended to take back that control and give it to unelected bureaucrats in Westminster. And this is a subject which, as James well knows, has been bubbling for a long time among both MPs and peers about who actually has primacy in their own houses. Now, it seems to me, without going into the details of it, it seems to me that the Owen Paterson affair has an awful lot that it suggests about our democracy not functioning well. I believe that the oversight that occurred was seriously lacking, basically what occurred would have been impossible in a judicial setup. Owen Paterson effectively wanted his day in court, was not given it, partly because the person who was judging him is not a judge. She's an absolutely typical archetypal bureaucrat. And there was so much wrong in her investigation. But then you end up in this position, of course, which was made much worse by the ridiculous U-turning of the Boris Johnson government. I mean, if you're going to spend political capital, as they were going to do, spend it and see it through. Don't spend it and then U-turn at the first cries of complaint. But the real thing is not just the oversight of MPs and the oversight of MPs' extracurricular or extra activities, but also in the House of Lords.
James, Douglas is pointing out here that he thinks that the oversight mechanisms currently in place can sometimes be too powerful. That's certainly something the allies of Owen Paterson have been saying these past few weeks. On the flip side, of course, especially in light of the Geoffrey Cox revelations, you have people saying that there simply hasn't been enough oversight. But it feels to me like we're getting to a far broader point here, and perhaps a more crucial one, which is, what is the job of an MP? And how much time and dedication should be put into that craft as opposed to other kinds of work?
So I personally think that having MPs who carry on with their former professions and trades while they are backbench MPs can be healthy. For example, just constitutionally, we have an Attorney General and a Solicitor General in our system and an Advocate General for Scotland. They all need to be lawyers. So you do need a certain number of lawyers to be practicing in the House of Commons. And, I think, Michael Howard and Ken Clarke are examples of the fact that you can combine a successful legal career at the bar with a successful parliamentary and political career. And that, I think, is healthy. I think where things become more dubious is when MPs are being paid for kind of political intelligence or things like that, rather than for carrying on with the jobs that they were doing. But I also think we have to make choices as a country. I think we lament the fact that there are so many professional politicians in the House of Commons. We lament the fact that there are so many, if one was being unkind, kind of super councillors in the House of Commons. If you don't want to have that, then you are going to need to allow us to have a system that does allow people to not to have to entirely give up their previous careers when they become politicians. And I think that is striking that balance. Now, I think you can get into specific arguments about how long people should be away or not. And I think the fact that Geoffrey Cox has spoken so little in the House of Commons in recent times doesn't do him any favours. But theoretically, I have no issue with someone being a QC and carrying on earning more from their legal practice than they do as a backbench MP, as long as they are speaking and participating in debates and generally raising the tone of scrutiny of legislation in the House of Commons. And I think this argument applies even more forcefully to the House of Lords. If you are to hugely restrict what Lords can do, then I think far fewer people will enter the House of Lords, because the dirty secret about the House of Lords is that the House of Lords doesn't have very much power, and the House of Lords will never be reformed, because the House of Commons does not want the House of Lords to be reformed in a way, because if the House of Lords was reformed, it would have to be given more power, it would have to be more of a check on the House of Commons than it currently is, and the House of Commons doesn't want that.
Can I just add one point? I agree with what James says, but there's one point that's very important here, which is that the example he cites of lawyers having, as it were, continuing their careers is a pertinent one, and also it needs to be caveated. it cannot be the case that the Commons is filled with full-time MPs and part-time MPs who are also part-time lawyers. And I say that because it cannot be the case that only practicing lawyers continue to practice in the Commons. Because we can't have, in my view, an ever-increasing legalisation of the political class. One of the things that the Commons needs is voices representing all sorts of different opinions, including opinions that have nothing to do with the legality of questions, but respond to the constituents' concerns about issues. All sorts of areas of our country have nothing to do with the law, but have things to do with everyday concerns of people. So as I say, there shouldn't be a sort of super MP who is also a practicing lawyer. But it is tricky terrain. As we know, I think that there are good rules in place regarding, as James says, sort of the really dodgy areas like political consultancy. But this has to be said because. And I'd add one other thing, by the way, which is James is totally right about this complete confusion among us in the general public on these issues of MPs and MPs' pay. We say we don't want professional politicians, but we don't like people from other professions either. We say that we want people to go into politics with a wealth of experience, and then we expect them to completely cut off that experience when they get into politics. This gets back to something I think has been a problem in our country for a while, which is a sort of a desire, effectively, with some good cause, to sort of punish the political class, to catch the politicians, the MPs in particular, in a kind of vice between two things that are screwing towards them and are keeping them locked in place. I don't think it's healthy. It's not a particularly healthy instinct for us to have either as a public.
James, last word to you.
So I obviously it shouldn't just be lawyers that you have in the House of Commons. You should have people from all walks of life. But I think that lawyers illustrate the problem with trying to have a kind of blanket ban on all outside interests, which I think is something that is going to gain traction as an idea following the way that the government has behaved in recent weeks. And the longer this scandal goes on, the more inclination there will be for the government to reach for some big dramatic thing to try and move the story on. And I think that would be a mistake. And so I think that is the problem we've got to deal with. I think we also need to work out that, I think that one of the crucial points that Douglas makes is Parliament has now had powers returned to it. And I think what we've got to see is that Parliament is prepared to use the powers it has had returned to it, and that Parliament is prepared to properly hold the executive to account, and Parliament is prepared to take more responsibility for its own affairs.
By the way, I know you said the last word to James, but can we just have a moment also to observe it, like a minute's silence, the complete horlicks that this government is capable of making of absolutely everything. From the smallest scandal to the biggest, there is nothing that Number 10 at the moment doesn't seem to be capable of blowing up into a huge storm. It's quite remarkable to watch.